Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to Unit 2. Did everybody pick up there's a one-page handout in the back of the room just for some stuff that we're going to be doing in class today. And if you don't yet have a set of cards, please grab a set in the back because we'll be using them for responses today. So we're starting Unit 2, where we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the sort of internal workings of animal bodies. And in particular, what we're going to start with today is this fundamental concept of homeostasis, or how we maintain a relatively constant internal environment, and dig into, in particular, thermal regulation. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's such a fundamental part of maintaining that internal environment. So we will be moving right along. So discussion sections will start up again this week, meeting on Wednesday and Saturday. Lab, and then on Wednesday, I will be handing things over to Dr. Zink. And so she's going to come in to talk about circulation and respiration, and that will put you in a really good position to participate in the heart dissection lab next week, which I have to say, I like all the labs this semester. That's one of my favorites, one of my maybe 4 favorites or so. And part of the reason that I like it so much is because it gives you an opportunity to really look at how the heart is structured and think through how all of the specific structures in the heart are really optimized for performing the functions that the heart needs to do, namely pumping your blood so that it will travel throughout your body. And so I think that you're going to really like that lab, and it's a really good one to dig into some of the concepts that we're going to be talking about in class on Wednesday. Yes? It's a calf heart. So then next week we'll have office hours, again in Science Center 418D. They'll happen on Monday as usual, 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. We are currently, the exams are currently being graded. They're getting close to done, but they're not quite there yet. So we hope to be able to release the scores tomorrow. And then there will be an optional Exam 1 correction assignment that you can do for extra credit. And so that's going to be due before spring break. And so we'll release the exam information on GradeScope. Everybody by now, I think, has used GradeScope and so is familiar with their interface and how you can see your scores and feedback. It's a little bit different on the exams because you didn't have to submit your assignments, but it should work pretty much the same way when it comes to getting your scores. And so that should be either tomorrow or Wednesday. And then you'll have about a week and a half to do that extra credit assignment. And again, it's optional. You don't have to do it. But we do think that it's a nice opportunity for you to revisit a topic that you may not have understood as well as you would have liked before the exam, and also get some points back on the test. And then we also have problem set 3, which is due Saturday. So we didn't realize that the P-sets for Unit 3 had actually gone live over the weekend. I know that some people have started working on them already. Some of the images for the GradeScope P-set weren't there yet. So they're there now, and you should be able to see it. And also, I don't know exactly what changes may or may not have been made to the multiple choice questions, but when I went in to say, like, hit go, it warned me that people had already started taking the P-set or started working on the P-set yesterday. And so if you're one of those folks, if you have any questions about any of the questions, please let us know, because I honestly don't know what the P-set looked like when you, I don't know what changes had gotten published and what changes might not have gotten published. Because we can't see the history of the P-set questions. We just see this is what the questions look like now. Oh, and heads up, that's not the same as it was originally. And some students have started looking at it. So if you have questions, let us know. If I could sort of go back in time and figure out what the changes were, then I would be more than happy to list them all out, but I'm not sure what they might have been. I don't think we made any major changes, but it did give me that warning, so I just wanted to give everyone a heads up. Does anybody have questions about that? Okay. I did notice that I think 1 or 2 people have actually submitted it already, in which case those changes should have no impact whatsoever on those. Okay, so today we are going to be digging into homeostasis. So we're going to start to understand how different systems can maintain homeostasis and what exactly that means. And then, as I mentioned earlier, look deeper at thermoregulation as one particular example of a key homeostatic process. So here what we have is an opportunity to just think about what it means for our bodies to exist and to do things at all times, right? Because our cells are always doing things, right? Even when we're sleeping, our cells are still existing. And so when we think about our bodies, there's a couple of key parts of our bodies that we need to think about. So there's our cells, our interstitial fluid, and our plasma, which all make up the different components in our bodies. And they need to be able to exchange materials with our external environment. So we have various types of fluid, which is where most of the molecules and things that we'll talk about are going to exist, right? So salts, proteins, fats, sugars, all these things, they exist in the fluid in our bodies, both inside of cells and also in what we call the interstitial fluid. So that's the fluid that just bathes our cells at all times, but it's not encapsulated in vessels. And then we have blood plasma, which is going to be a fluid that is going to be responsible for transporting substances throughout our body in vessels. So various substances, as you can see here, will be transported from our external environment through the lungs, for example. We take gases like oxygen in from our environment. Those gases are first transferred into the blood plasma. Then they move to the interstitial fluid, which allows them to diffuse into cells. And our cells need that oxygen in order to perform metabolism. Our cells do metabolism, aerobic respiration for the most part, and they produce carbon dioxide, which they then need to get rid of. So the carbon dioxide is going to take the opposite path out of the body. It's going to go from the cells to the interstitial fluid, from the interstitial fluid to the blood, and then from the blood back to the lungs and out back into the environment. And so here we have a situation where one set of components are coming in and another set of components are coming out in order to maintain the balance of, or maintain the amount of oxygen that our cells need to continue to respire, and in order to permit those cells to release that carbon dioxide that they're producing. Because you don't want to have too much carbon dioxide building up inside of those cells. So this is one example where we have to maintain a balance of the right amounts of these different gases inside our cells. And then you can look at other things like nutrients and salts and different waste products where you have the same thing. Cells are going to take in nutrients from our environment, and then they're going to release waste products, which travel through various extracellular fluids to different organs, and then out into the environment. We'll dig more into the actual processes by which those nutrients and gases and things are absorbed and those waste products are released throughout the semester. For now, I just want you to be comfortable with the idea that you do have this exchange between the internal environment of our bodies and the external environment all the time. And this is all happening so that our bodies can maintain a relatively constant internal environment with the right nutrients, the right gases coming in, and the right gases and waste products being released. And higher animals, such as humans, have evolved very complex physiological control systems to maintain those relatively constant internal conditions. And these physiological control systems all fall under the banner of systems that are responsible for maintaining what we call homeostasis. So what is homeostasis? Well, it's a balancing act. So homeostasis is what allows us to, in response to some kind of physiological or environmental stress, rebalance things and get back to normal. So when we undergo some kind of physiological environmental stress, we get thrown out of balance or out of whack, and then a homeostatic response allows us to get back in balance where we need to go. And if this doesn't happen, then in some cases, if the imbalance is extreme, it can actually lead to death. But for the most part, our bodies are able to respond to a large range of fluctuations and maintain homeostasis. So this is a dynamic process, which means that it requires energy. And it's a way to maintain, as we've said, stable physical and biochemical conditions in the body for things like temperature, nutrient levels, gases, wastes, pH, salt, and also just liquid volume in our bodies. So these are all of the things that we want to keep in balance in order to maintain optimum functioning. And so in order to do this, there are a number of different homeostatic systems, each of which is going to be responsible for maintaining the appropriate balance for one of these variables. And these homeostatic systems share common features. So first, they maintain a steady state. This means that there is no net change in condition, but it's not an equilibrium. It's not like a chemical reaction where things overall aren't changing, because it requires a continual energy input. Right? So things aren't changing, but things aren't changing because you're using energy to keep them the same. Each homeostatic system will also have some kind of a set point. This is the steady state value that is considered ideal or optimum. So this is what the homeostatic system is trying to maintain. For some things, that set point is really an actual point. So for example, for most humans, the thermoregulatory set point is usually 98.6. Right? So we want to actually maintain that particular core body temperature. In other cases, a variable might have a normal range instead of a set point. And so blood glucose is one example of this, where there's no one value that you're trying to maintain. You're trying to stay within a range. Within the body, a homeostatic system will use what we call feedback information to evaluate current conditions. So I consider this like a status report. And so with this feedback information, each system is going to have a comparator that's responsible for analyzing the information, analyzing that feedback information in relation to the set point to determine if a response is needed. And a response is going to be necessary if that feedback information tells the body that you've deviated from the set point. That's what's considered an error signal, which leads to a response. So an error signal is just a difference between the set point and feedback information, or it gets triggered when you get outside the normal range. And regulatory signals are neuronal or hormonal signals that will activate or inhibit specific physiological responses that will ideally help to reduce that error signal. It'll help you get back to that homeostatic set point. And they do this through the work of effectors. And these effectors will actually be the things responsible for causing changes to the internal environment. And all of these things together form a bit of a homeostatic system cycle. So for example, here what we have is a regulated variable, such as temperature or pH. And now let's say that there is some kind of stimulus or a fluctuation in this variable where you've moved away from the set point. The sensor is going to detect this change and provide feedback information through what's known as the afferent pathway or information input. That information is getting input into what we call a homeostatic control center. And so the control center is responsible for receiving these various signals and initiating a response. And so that control center takes in information, and then it sends out information through what's called the efferent pathway, information output. And the effect of this is going to be to have some kind of impact on the activity of an effector that will make a change happen, ideally to return that response. Ideally, that response will help return whatever that variable is to its set point or into its normal range. And then you'll stay at whatever that set point is unless you get some other fluctuation, at which point the stimulus will again activate the system to get you back in place. Everybody with me so far? Okay. There are two main types of responses that regulatory systems can have. There's negative feedback systems and positive feedback responses. So negative feedback generally acts to correct an error signal. So what happens is that you have an initial stimulus, this deviation from your set point. This triggers a response, which then reduces the magnitude of that stimulus. So you're making that error signal smaller and smaller and smaller until you get back to the set point and the stimulus is no longer there. Right? You're no longer throwing an error signal. In contrast, positive feedback amplifies a response, and it increases a deviation from the set point. So your initial stimulus triggers a response, and then that response actually increases the magnitude of that stimulus. That then triggers the response more, which increases the magnitude of that stimulus more, and so on and so forth. So in the case of negative feedback, the response loop actually shuts itself off when you get back to your set point, whereas for positive feedback, some kind of outside factor is required to shut off the feedback cycle, or the cycle can go to completion. And we'll talk about what that means in a second. Which of these do you think plays a larger role in homeostasis, negative feedback or positive feedback? In 3, 2, 1, yes, negative feedback is going to be far more common in homeostatic systems. Does anybody know an example of positive feedback? And so we'll talk about a lot of examples of negative feedback. Does anybody know of an example of positive feedback? Yeah? Childbirth, exactly. So can you tell me a little bit more about how that works? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So when a woman is getting ready to go into labor, the baby gets into position, and then it starts pressing on her cervix. This causes the release of oxytocin, which causes uterine contractions, which push the baby down further, harder on the cervix, which then again causes the cervix to stretch, stimulating the release of oxytocin, and blah, 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 until the baby finally comes out. And so here what you have is a positive feedback loop where oxytocin release causes contractions, which by causing cervical stretching leads to more oxytocin release, and so on and so forth. And so this is one of the reasons why if labor is being induced, they'll use what's called Pitocin, which is the brand name for an oxytocin, for a version of oxytocin that you can actually administer to a woman to either cause labor to start or to cause labor to progress faster. And so it's just really pushing hard on this oxytocin release when you use that hormone. So let's take another look at how this can all work out, focusing on a regulatory system and thinking about the role of the control center. So you can think of the control center really as the site of integration of feedback information and the response. So here what we have is an example where we're looking at a particular variable, so temperature. And in this particular system, the temperature set point is 30 degrees here. So that's shown in this red line. And then in this situation, we have a normal range of function where between 29 and 31 degrees, you're close enough to the set point that you're not going to trigger significant responses. But if you get beyond that normal range, then you'll start having more significant responses. And so what happens is that if an individual starts out at that set point, right, if their body is trying to maintain that set point, when they deviate, they'll have some sort of response to cause them to return to that set point. Here, they overshot a little bit, so then that response shut off and they went back to the set point. But maybe they shut it off too hard, so it went down further. And then here we have a stronger response, which will trigger a response loop to get it back to the set point. And again, it's going to overshoot, but get to the upper barrier of the normal range of function. Then negative feedback will turn that response loop off, and then it can go back down, and so on and so forth. So you're fluctuating within a fairly narrow range. And this is due to the activity of the control center, which is trying to maintain that set point or normal range. It uses, as I mentioned earlier, a comparator to look for error signals and responds to those error signals by regulating effectors using hormones or neuronal signaling. And there are some cases where these regulatory systems can actually reset the set points. For example, because an individual is progressing through life stages, because of cyclic changes in circadian rhythms or the daily rhythms of life, or hormone cycles that might occur over the span of a month or a year or something similar. You can also have changes in response to long-term environmental changes, or in anticipation of a changing environment. So these are conditions where you may actually start out having one set point and then modify it due to any one of a number of different, for a number of different reasons, either physiological or environmental. And there are two broad classes of responses. So there's acclimatization and also using feed-forward information. So long-term stresses, these are often environmental but can also be physiological. These can result in reversible changes to a set point. And these are often the result of long-term changes in the external environment that cause physiological stresses internally. You can also have set points altered due to life stages or events, hormonal or seasonal cycles, and circadian rhythms using feed-forward information. So this is different from the feedback information that was like the status check. This feed-forward information anticipates changes and alters the set point accordingly. So take a minute or 30 seconds and see if you can think of any examples of acclimatization or feed-forward information. Talk to your neighbor. Okay, so what have people come up with? Some examples for acclimatization. Any ideas? Yeah?
You could have spring mating behavior set by circadian rhythm levels.
Okay, so the body knows spring's coming, and so that causes changes in the behavior. Is that an example of acclimatization, or is that feed-forward information? Okay, yes, feed-forward information, just checking. Does anybody have examples of acclimatization? Yeah? So I suppose that's possible. I don't know what kinds of changes the fish undergo when they leave a pond, but it's possible that they could undergo some acclimatization for sure. Any other ideas? Yeah? Yeah, so that could be one example, would be if an organism is in a colder environment and it builds up a layer of brown fat so that it can generate more heat. If that brown fat layer was not something that it would have in a different environment, then that could be an example of acclimatization, absolutely. Any other ideas? Yeah? So we'll talk about hibernation later. I don't want to get into that just yet, but good prediction. Any other ideas? Yeah? So it depends. So feed-forward information would mean that the animal needs a reason to anticipate that it's going to get cold and that it starts storing brown fat before it actually gets cold. From what I understand about how that works, usually it's in response to prolonged cold exposure. So that would be acclimatization. Another example that you may be familiar with is people at high altitudes or animals at high altitudes. They will produce more red blood cells, and that will allow them to use oxygen more efficiently. And so this is not something that, unless you take a hormonal supplement to cause yourself to produce those more red blood cells, you won't do that in preparation for reaching a high altitude. You get to high altitude, you'll be short of breath, your body will be in, it's called altitude sickness that some people get, which are symptoms associated with not having enough oxygen. And I can tell you, as somebody who's experienced altitude sickness, it's quite unpleasant. But it does go away after a couple of days, and part of that is because your body has started to acclimatize. And actually, if you do spend a week or two at altitude and then come back down, exercising is easier than it has ever been before. Sadly, that doesn't last. Just like your body is only temporarily going to boost your red blood cell count while you're at altitude, it's not going to maintain that when you're at sea level. But that's one example there. And then an example, so we had feed-forward information, could be in preparation for mating season, you would get changes to behavior. Another example is here, where in preparation for getting dinner, an animal will actually salivate ahead of time because it knows that it's going to need that saliva, right? It needs to reset the saliva production set point to so that the saliva is available when it starts to eat its food. So now what we're going to do is just use an analogy to think about some ways that this works in the body. And so you should have on your handout a diagram of a house. And we're going to think of the house's heating and cooling system as an example of a homeostatic system. And so see if you can figure out where the set point's determined, what the control center is, the sensor, effectors, and what might provide some feed-forward information. Okay, so let's see what people are thinking. Where's the set point determined? What determines the set point of a house's heating and cooling system? Yeah? The thermostat, yeah, exactly. What is going to be the control center? Yeah? So the control center is actually also the thermostat. What would you consider, so the thermometer is related to that, yes. So the thermometer is actually the sensor. And so the control center here, this thermostat, has the sensor, it contains the set point, and it's also going to perform that error calculation and throw an error signal if the current temperature, as measured by the thermometer, is distinct from the set point that was set in the thermostat. Does that make sense? Okay. So what would be the effectors? So we've got the furnace and the air conditioner. And so can anybody tell me how is it that they're getting activated? Right, so it's going to be signals from the thermostat will activate whichever one is appropriate if the actual temperature is too high or too low. And where could you get some feed-forward information in this system? The clock, yes. And so what is the clock going to do? Yeah? Right, so the clock will be responsible for recording the time of day, and then you might reset, or the thermostat might change the set point based on the time of day if, for example, you've said to turn up the heat in preparation for you getting home in the evening. Does that make sense? So we're going to look at a lot of different homeostatic control systems throughout the rest of the semester. We're going to focus actually more on thermal regulation in class today. But what you want to do is anytime you're thinking about one of these systems, try to see if you can identify all of these different components. And in many cases, there will be one part of the system that's responsible for multiple things. In particular, because the control center integrates a lot of information and also sends regulatory signals out, that's where a lot of the action is going to be happening. What we're going to do now, though, is shift our focus and really zoom in on thermal regulation as it relates not to a housing system, but to an animal body. So our bodies are limited in that they actually can't respond to an infinite variety of conditions. There's going to be a range, in some cases more narrow, in some cases more broad, in which we're able to survive. When it comes to thermal regulation, this allows animals to maintain their body temperature within a specific range. Above about 40 degrees Celsius, most proteins begin to denature, and below about 0 degrees Celsius, ice crystals are going to start to form. And what we'll see is that many metabolic processes are temperature sensitive, so that although there are exceptions, while cells can often survive between 0 degrees Celsius and 40 degrees Celsius, most organisms actually have a much narrower temperature range because their metabolic processes are going to change too much when you go to extremes that are that far. And at least in mammals, the part of the body that's responsible for temperature regulation is the hypothalamus. So that's going to be the control center. We'll get back to the hypothalamus in class a little bit later. What we're going to focus on right now is this idea that metabolic processes are temperature sensitive. And in particular, we're going to talk about a metric known as Q10, which defines the temperature sensitivity for a particular biological process. So Q10 is the factor by which a metabolic process or a chemical reaction increases with a 10 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. And I realized I meant to write this on the board. So Q10 so we have Q10, this value, is equal to R2 divided by R1 to the power of 10 divided by T2 minus T1. A key thing to keep in mind is that anytime you're doing one of these calculations, R2 and T2 have to be the higher temperature. This is not the same equation that is given in your textbook, because in your textbook, it gives you an equation where you need to have reaction values that were measured at temperature differences of 10 degrees. The fact of the matter is, it is not often feasible to actually measure reactions or biological processes at temperature differences of 10 degrees. So this equation is a much more useful one because it allows you to calculate the Q10 value at whatever two temperatures you have available. Does that make sense? So you should be familiar, you should know this equation and be able to use it. Yes? Yes, we're still calculating a 10-degree difference, but by having the exponent be 10 divided by the difference between the temperatures, that's how we're able to scale it for whatever the temperature difference is. If you're looking at a 10-degree temperature difference, then this is 10 over 10, and so then you just have the R2 over R1. Yeah? So we'll do that right now. So most biological Q10 values are between 2 and 3. So the Q10 value is going to be somewhere between 2 and 3. And so that is indicated by these two lines on the graph here. So Q10 equals 1 means that the reaction rate is not affected by temperature changes. In other words, the reaction rate is constant no matter what the temperature is. A Q10 value of 2 means that the reaction rate doubles with every 10-degree increase in temperature. And a Q10 of 3 means that the reaction rate triples with every 10-degree increase in temperature. Yeah?
I just want to make sure.
Oh, yes, sorry, yeah. So there should be, yep, it is this ratio raised to this power. Make sense? Okay. So let's give this a try. Oh, yeah? So this does not really tell you the range that a metabolic process can survive in, because that metabolic process is probably going to be more sensitive. The actual existence of that process is probably going to be more sensitive to proteins being denatured than it is to 2 to 3 degree changes in temperature. So what does this tell you? It tells you literally how temperature sensitive the process is. And so this will become, we'll see the significance of this in a minute. Yes? Yep. No, so this is, so let's look at this example, and I think then it'll make more sense, okay? So toads capture prey by tongue projection. In other words, their tongues shoot out of their mouth and stick the prey and then bring the prey back into their mouth. So this involves 2 types of movement. Elastically powered ballistic movement, so when the mouth opens and the tongue projects, and muscle-powered movement when the tongue is retracted and the mouth closes. So we have some data below that were taken to determine the effect of an animal's body temperature on this process. Something that I do want to highlight is that when we're looking at Q10 values, what we're looking at is the animal's body temperature. This is not an environmental temperature thing. This is looking at what's going on in the animal itself. So toad tongue projection velocity was calculated for toads maintained at different environmental temperatures. And this works for toads because their body temperatures tend to match their environmental temperatures. Everybody with me? So we want to calculate the Q10 value for each phase of prey capture and determine if each phase is temperature sensitive. So for example, we have an animal body temperature of 17 degrees. The tongue projection velocity is 1.6 meters per second. The tongue retraction velocity is 0.4 meters per second. And then for the animal body temperature of 24, the tongue projection velocity is 1.7 meters per second, and the retraction velocity is 0.8 meters per second. So see if you can calculate the Q10 value for each phase of prey capture. Yeah? We will not deal with negative Q10s because they're generally not biologically relevant. So you don't have to round to whole numbers, but you could round to tenths or hundredths. Okay, so who's got some ideas for what our Q10 values might be? Yep, we want to do both. Yep. Okay, so for tongue projection, 1.09. Do I have anybody agree? Seeing yes, okay. And that is what I would get as well. So 1.7 divided by 1.6 to the 10 divided by 7 gives you 1.09. And then what about for tongue retraction? Yeah? 2.69? General agreement? Yes? Okay. So tongue retraction using the same formula, 2.69. What would you say about the temperature sensitivity of these two processes? Yeah? Yeah, so tongue retraction is falling in that Q10 of between 2 and 3, showing some pretty strong temperature sensitivity. Tongue projection is 1.09, which is not really showing very much temperature sensitivity here. So I would say that overall, tongue projection is not temperature sensitive, really. It's not exactly one, but it's very close, whereas tongue retraction is temperature sensitive. And for our purposes, when we have 2 data points, we're going to look for Q10 values of greater than about 1.2 to say that a process is, in fact, temperature sensitive. And we can see this in the video here, where we're actually looking at 2 toads whose tongue projections have been synchronized at different temperatures. Right, so tongue goes out at about the same rate and is retracted much more slowly at the lower temperature. And so this is an example of one type of process for which you could measure a Q10 value. You could also measure things like cell division. You could measure things like a particular chemical reaction. You can measure all sorts of different biological processes. The key thing is that you have to be able to look at that process at different temperatures in order to do these calculations. Any questions about this? Yeah?
So the 2 rates can literally be
Yes, any kind of rates that you can compare. And then back to what somebody asked before about, like, will you have negative Q10 values? Like, if you ever get a negative Q10 value, that should be a clue to you that, like, what you're looking at is not a reaction that's temperature sensitive. What you're looking at in that case is something like proteins being denatured, or like something else that's interfering with this process or reaction. Okay? Okay. So now let's think about how it is that animals are actually able to maintain relatively constant body temperatures, because it's actually kind of problematic if you have a situation where you have different processes responding differently to changes in temperature. It's not so bad for tongue projection, because, okay, let's say your tongue goes out, your tongue comes back a little bit slower than it might otherwise if you're a frog. But if you're looking at the balance of different chemical reactions that are taking place in a cell, if those reactions have different Q10 values, if the animal's body temperature changes, the effect of that on these reactions won't be the same if their Q10 values are different. And then all of a sudden, your body reactions are going to get thrown out of whack, where some of them are going to speed up faster than others, and that can cause a lot of problems. So animals some animals spend a lot of energy, and others have various other kinds of adaptations to try to maintain a relatively constant internal environment. If they're not able to do that, they may actually have other ways of moderating the efficiency of different chemical reactions by using different enzymes that are more active at different temperatures and things like that to avoid this discrepancy in different Q10 values. So now let's take a look at different ways that animals can thermoregulate. And we're going to break this down into 2 broad classes. We have ectotherms, whose body temperature is determined primarily by external sources of heat. In other words, their body temperature is largely determined by heat exchange with the environment. So this is going to be things like lizards, like most fish, like insects, etc. Then we have endotherms. These regulate their body temperature by producing heat through metabolic means in a very deliberate way, or by losing it in what you could consider energetically expensive ways, like sweating. So in endotherms, in addition to this metabolic heat regulation, they can also lose or gain heat by transfer to or from the environment. And this is going to be things like mammals, a lot of birds, etc. Your textbook also brings up this thing called a heterotherm, which is something that is sometimes ectothermic and sometimes endothermic. There's no real firm dividing line, so what we're going to do is we're going to focus on thermoregulatory strategies as being broadly ectothermic or broadly endothermic, because there are actually cases where humans have acted like ectotherms, or where insects have acted like endotherms. So like heterotherm, you could just say that almost everything is a heterotherm, and then you kind of lose the point. Another way that we can classify animals is based on the constancy of their body temperature. So homeotherms are animals that maintain a relatively constant internal temperature, whereas poikilotherms are animals whose internal temperature varies considerably. So indicate if each of the following statements, if you think it's true or false, And if a statement is false, see if you can revise it to be true. Okay, so let's start with this first one. Most endotherms are poikilotherms. What do you think? In 3, 2, 1. Okay, yes, excellent. That one is false. How could you correct it to make it true? Most ectotherms are poikilotherms. That would be a good one. Okay, number 2. Having processes with widely ranging Q10 values is a greater challenge for poikilotherms than homeotherms. In 3, 2, 1. Yes, exactly. And as I mentioned earlier, animals that have body temperatures that tend to vary widely may have between 4 and 10 different versions of enzymes so that they can keep reactions happening at consistent paces. Okay, humans are never poikilothermic. In 3, 2, 1. So that one is false. So a lot of people picked that one up. Why? How would you correct this? Humans are sometimes okay. I would say humans are rarely poikilothermic. We do tend to maintain relatively constant body temperatures. There's a couple of rare examples that I did find. So there are instances of traditional societies where, in very rare cases, individuals go through these extreme temperature changes with circadian rhythms, where when they're asleep, their body temperatures will actually drop quite dramatically to something close to the ambient temperature, and then will rise again as sunrise approaches. There's also something called the, paradoxical, a poikilothermic period after paradoxical sleep onset in humans. So it is a brief period of time where temperature regulation is much less tight in humans. So humans can exhibit poikilothermic characteristics, but for the most part, we are homeotherms. Yeah? So is the ability of a human to get a fever evidence of being poikilothermic? Generally speaking, not really, because poikilothermy refers to a wider range of temperature fluctuations than we usually associate with a fever. So it'd be something like going from hypothermia to a fever. That might be the kind of swing that you'd expect, but a couple of degrees here and there would not be. Okay. So now we're going to think about the different processes that actually affect body temperature. And so many of these are physical processes through which animals or other organisms will exchange heat with their environment. And so there's 4 broad classes. So there's radiation. That's the emission of infrared radiation by all objects warmer than absolute zero. So all of us here are emitting infrared radiation. Everything around us is emitting infrared radiation. And whether what we're getting is a net gain of heat or a net loss of heat from this has to do with our relative temperature compared to our surroundings. So if we are warmer than our surroundings, then we are, generally speaking, giving off more heat than we're taking in. If we're cooler than our surroundings, then we're going to be taking in more heat than we're giving off. But everything gives off some amount of infrared radiation. There's convection. So that's the transfer of heat by movement of air or water past a surface. We have evaporation. That is explicitly the removal of heat from the surface of a liquid that's losing some of its molecules as gas. And then we have conduction, which is the direct transfer of heat between 2 objects that are in contact with each other. Okay? And an energy budget reflects different adaptations that an organism will have for regulating its body temperature. So the energy budget is just the balance of heat production or heat intake and it's the balance of heat production and heat exchange. So in other words, we have heat that comes in from radiation, conduction, convection, or metabolism. That's heat being produced by the organism. And then we have heat out, which can be in the form of radiation, conduction, convection, or evaporation. And what we're going to spend a good chunk of time talking about today is adaptations that can help animals thermoregulate, as well as specific thermoregulatory responses. But to make sure that we're all on the same page about what these different processes mean, I want to take a minute to think through what's happening to you right now. You are, hopefully, maintaining a stable body temperature. And so for each of the following categories, indicate if it's causing you to gain or lose heat and where the heat is being transferred to or from. Okay, so let's see what people are thinking. So metabolism, on balance, is that going to be a net gain or loss of heat? Right, so that's going to be a way that you generate heat. So you're just sitting there doing nothing will generate some amount of heat. If you needed to generate more heat, you might shiver or move around to further increase your metabolic rate and correspondingly the amount of heat being produced. What about radiation? Right, so that one, for now at least, is a negative. You're probably losing more heat to the air and the surroundings than you're gaining. In some cases, you might actually be gaining more heat if you're out in the sun, for example, and it's warmer. What about convection? If there's air currents that are moving, what are they doing? Those are causing the loss of heat, so airflow in the room can also carry heat away from the body. What about conduction? So I hear most people saying loss or gain. Right, so in most cases, this is going to be heat loss. So you're probably sitting on a seat that's got a lower temperature than your body. So heat is being transferred from you to that seat. And then what about evaporation? Evaporation is pretty much always going to be heat loss. And that can happen both through sweating. So if you perspire, then you produce water that can evaporate. You lose a lot of water vapor from your lungs, which is actually another form of evaporative heat loss. It's not one that your body is going to have a lot of control over, but it is going to have a significant impact on your energy budget. Yeah? So we're talking about heat from your body. So if you're sitting on a cold seat, you're losing heat to that seat. If you're sitting on a warm seat, then you might be gaining it. So we're thinking about the temperature, the movement of heat. It's always from whatever is warmer to whatever is colder. The net movement is always from whatever is warmer to whatever is colder. And so if we're thinking about these various factors in our environment that can cause us to gain or lose heat, we want to recognize that ectotherms and endotherms are actually going to respond differently as these different factors change. So here what we have are two graphs showing the body temperature of a mouse, which is an endotherm, and a lizard, which is an ectotherm, at different environmental temperatures. So if we start with the lizard, what you see here is that the lizard's body temperature rises as the environmental temperature rises. And that's characteristic of ectotherms, is that by and large, their body temperature will come close to matching the environmental temperature. It's usually not a perfect match, but it's going to be close. In contrast, the mouse has a relatively constant body temperature over a wide range of environmental temperatures. And it's only when you get to the extremes that the mouse's body temperature is actually going to be going up or down at all. And even when it does that, it's not going to go all the way up to the environmental temperature, or all the way down or up to the environmental temperature. It's going to still remain in some kind of range, as long as the animal's alive. And then we can look at the effect that temperature changes have on an individual's metabolic rate. And so this comes back to what we talked about when we looked at Q10. So Q10 is the temperature responsiveness of biological processes to changes in body temperature. So the lizard, its body temperature rises as the environmental temperature changes. Similarly, the lizard's metabolic rate is also going to rise as the environmental temperature changes. And that's because the metabolic rate is changing as the body temperature rises. Right? So the metabolic rate overall is showing a Q10 value of greater than 1. As the temperature goes up, metabolism goes up. In contrast, the mouse has a very different metabolic response to changes in the environmental temperature. When the environmental temperature is low, the mouse is spending a lot of energy to stay warm. When the environmental temperature is in what's called the thermoneutral zone, the mouse does not have to spend metabolic energy to stay warm or to cool itself off. As the environmental temperature rises above the thermoneutral zone, the mouse's metabolism will rise again because now it's using metabolic energy not to make heat, but to dissipate it. And the last thing that I want to point out here before we move on to zooming in on what's going on with the metabolic rate is the differences in the metabolic rate scales for the lizard and the mouse. So the metabolic rate of the lizard and the metabolic rate of any ectotherm is much lower than the metabolic rate of an endotherm of a similar size. And that's because the ectotherm is not spending metabolic energy on thermoregulation. It's using energy from the environment to regulate its body temperature. Or it's not regulating its body temperature very much, and it's allowing its body temperature to fluctuate along with the environmental temperature. Yeah? The question is, how can an increase in metabolic rate dissipate temperature? And we'll talk about this briefly later, but mostly through sweating. So sweating is actually very energetically expensive. Okay, so now let's focus in on ectotherms, right? So this is like the lizard that we had here, focusing on this blue line. So an animal's metabolic rate is just all of the energy that the animal is using in a given time interval. Ectotherms' body temperatures tend to follow environmental temperatures. And since most metabolic processes have a Q10 value of about 2 to 3, that means that metabolic rate changes as body temperature changes. So they're both going to go up together. In contrast, when it comes, and so an ectotherm's metabolic rate rises as the environmental temperature increases. In contrast, when it comes to endotherms, you first have to start out with what we call the basal metabolic rate. So that's an endotherm's metabolic cost of living. It's just the energy that they need to carry out minimal bodily functions, which include thermal regulation, digestion, respiration, etc. So this is measured at rest with an empty stomach and without stress. So the animal's not going to be moving around, it's not going to be stressed, it's not at any kind of extreme temperature. And so this basal metabolic rate is measured in a resting endotherm at a temperature within what we call its thermoneutral zone. So it's going to be this range here, where it doesn't need to use metabolic energy in order to maintain its temperature set point. And so when we look at mammals, what we see is that basal metabolic rate is correlated with body size. So overall, larger animals need more energy. And that's what we see here, that absolute BMR increases with animal size. However, The situation looks a little bit different if you actually scale this to the size of an animal's body, where in fact, the basal metabolic rate per kilogram of tissue actually increases as animal size goes down. So if you look ounce for ounce at a shrew versus an elephant, the shrew is going to have, per ounce of tissue, a higher metabolic rate than the elephant. So what factor do you think causes smaller animals to have higher BMRs for their size? So I'm hearing a couple of people say it, the surface area to volume ratio, yes. So an increase in the surface area to volume ratio, that's going to be smaller animals will have a greater surface area for their volume. This causes smaller animals to lose more heat to their environment relative to their overall size by radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. And then finally, an endotherm's thermoneutral zone is bounded by critical temperatures. So here what we have is a graph showing an animal's body temperature at different environmental temperatures and its metabolic rate at those same environmental temperatures. The lower critical temperature is the lowest temperature at which it doesn't need to spend significant metabolic energy to raise its temperature. The upper critical temperature is the highest temperature at which it doesn't need to spend extra energy to cool itself off. So within this thermoneutral zone, thermoregulatory responses use very little energy. And we'll look at what some of those responses will be in a few minutes. In contrast, outside the thermoneutral zone, these responses require a lot of energy. So that's why you see the metabolic rate rising rapidly as you go below the lower critical temperature and above the upper critical temperature. You can also extend the slope of this line down to identify the set point for an animal's body temperature, which tends to correspond to something close to but slightly below the upper critical temperature. I also want to mention that I wouldn't use the scale, like the death point on this graph. Don't take it too literally. It's not that if your body temperature is like 37 degrees, that above 40 degrees, you're doomed. Animals have a number of thermoregulatory responses that they can use to dissipate heat, even to survive above those temperatures. But that doesn't mean that we can actually go too extreme. So this was from 2018 when there was a heat wave in Karachi, and dozens of people died in temperatures that were in like the 112 to 115 degree range. And part of the reason that this was so bad was because it was at the start of Ramadan when people were fasting. And so it was a combination of the extreme temperatures and people not having the metabolic energy that they needed to actually do the thermoregulation, so both the metabolic energy and also the water that they would need in order to sweat. So people were both dehydrated and didn't have, and fasting. And so they were less able to cope with these high temperatures. But even so, we're still looking at temperatures that are like 8, 9, 10 degrees above the set point, not, like 2 or 3. And so one of the ways that people actually dealt with this was, in fact, to use evaporative cooling not through sweat that was produced by their bodies to, in fact, puncture water lines and get water, like the way people will open up fire hydrants and things to get water on hot days so that they can use evaporative cooling even if they're not the ones producing the water. And so with that, we will take a 5-minute break. And when we get back, we'll talk more specifically about not just these physical processes that you can manipulate for thermoregulation, but also some physiological processes. Okay, welcome back. So what I want to start out with is just a quick brainstorm for what are some ways that animals can regulate their body temperatures. Who's got some ideas? We've already talked about some of them, so, throw them out. Yeah? Right, so you can have a behavioral thing where you move into the sun when you're cold, you move into the shade when you're hot. What else? Yeah? Right, so sweating and panting, using evaporative cooling. Yep. Digestive processes, that's an interesting one. I suppose anytime you're using more muscles, that could be generating heat. So that's also where shivering comes from. That's another one, yeah. So hibernation is a special one that we'll get back to later, but yes, yeah. So sleeping in and of itself isn't so much a thermoregulatory response, but you can have thermoregulatory changes that occur when you sleep. Yeah?
Are there animals that can
So animals that can intentionally
lower
lower their heart rate, can you tell me more about that? What do you...
So they lower their heart rate,
So I think that what you're talking about actually comes down more under the category of hibernation and something called torpor, which we'll talk about, yeah?
insulation.
Right, insulation, right, so that can help you to save heat. Other ideas? Anything else? Yeah? Right, so having feathers or fur, so you can have fat insulation or feathers, fur, etc. Yeah? Shivering, yes. So that'll generate a lot of heat. Okay, so we'll talk about these and some others in the next 45 minutes or so. So let's start out with the kinds of thermoregulatory responses that are shared by both ectotherms and endotherms. These are, for the most part, going to be behavioral types of regulatory strategies. So here what we have is an example. So behavior overall can alter heat exchange with the environment. So an animal could enter a burrow in order to stay warmer, to maintain heat, or bask in the sun in order to take in heat, or it could seek shade if it's getting overheated and needs to cool off. You could also have more complex behaviors like nest construction and social behaviors such as huddling, which can help to maintain heat as well. So let's look at this example here where we have a lizard. And so a lizard is an ectotherm, meaning that its body temperature is broadly going to be, its body temperature is going to be dependent on heat exchange with the environment. And so the animal's body temperature is shown in this blue line here. And the environmental temperature is shown in this orange line here. So what you'll see is that the body temperature does not track perfectly with the environmental temperature because the animal is going to use behavioral strategies to maintain a more constant body temperature than what the environment alone would maintain. So for example, when the sun comes up and the environmental temperature is going to start to rise, the lizard leaves its burrow. Right? So overnight, the lizard is in its burrow. Green is the temperature of the burrow, and so the lizard's body temperature tracks very closely with the burrow temperature. When the sun comes up and the environmental temperature is going to start to rise, the lizard leaves its burrow and starts to take advantage of some of that environmental heat from the sun. So it's going to take in some radiant heat. And then as the environmental temperature continues to rise, the lizard's body temperature is going to keep rising. And it's going to move between the sun and the shade to maintain a relatively consistent internal body temperature. So early on in the day, when the environmental temperature is lower but the sun is out, it'll spend more time in the sun. So it's taking in that infrared radiation. When the environmental temperature is higher than what the lizard wants to maintain as its set point, it's going to spend more time in the shade to reduce the amount of infrared radiation that it takes in. And then later on, later in the afternoon, as the environmental temperature starts to drop again, the animal will spend more time in the sun again. Until finally, at the end of the day, it'll go to its burrow, and in its burrow, the body temperature will be maintained relatively close to the burrow temperature. Pretty consistently, though, what you see is that the animal's body temperature is a bit higher than the burrow. Why do you think that is? Yeah? Yeah, there is some metabolic heat being produced. It's not very much. It's not enough to maintain the animal's body temperature much higher than the burrow, but it will cause it to be somewhat higher than the burrow. And so for ectotherms, this is pretty much how they're able to regulate their body temperature, is by using behavioral responses to alter heat exchange with the environment. For endotherms, this is going to be like a first line of defense. Yeah? So endotherms are generally going to have an actual temperature set point that they very actively maintain. So they would have something like this, but it would extend throughout the day, including into the evening, for most endotherms. Yeah. So their body temperature might fluctuate a little bit, but it usually is going to fluctuate in a narrower range, and it's going to maintain that range continually, as opposed to being like burrow temperature at night and then somewhere around here during the day. Sorry, was that if an ectotherm can't go outside? Well, so some ectotherms do hibernate, so then they'll be inside for a long period of time. I mean, anything that's going to prevent them from hunting and getting food would impact their long-term survival. But there are ways that they can dramatically reduce their metabolism to reduce the amount that they have to go out, depending on the conditions. Okay, so now let's start thinking more about what endotherms are going to be doing, because endotherms are spending a lot of metabolic energy to heat themselves up, and so they're going to want to be really careful in terms of not losing too much of that heat to the environment. And so there are a number of things that they have in order to try to maintain as much of that heat as they can. The first somebody mentioned is insulation, which is going to reduce the flow of heat between the body and the environment. This could include hair, feathers, and layers of fat. And the reason that this works is because these will, in terms of feathers and hair, there's going to be a thick layer of air that will be trapped in there. That air will get heated by radiation and conduction from the animal's body surface. And so that layer of air will actually get warm, and air is not a great heat conductor. And so that'll reduce the amount of heat that the animal then loses, because they have this air that's heated up and trapped between them and the environment. Humans and a lot of aquatic animals rely primarily on fat for insulation, but humans do have a bit of an evolutionary remnant of fluffing up feathers, which is goosebumps. And so when you get a goosebump, what happens is that there's a muscle at the base of each hair follicle that actually contracts to cause the hair to stick up, and it forms this goosebump. But unless you are extremely hairy, it is not going to be enough to trap a layer of air between your skin and the environment the way a layer of feathers or fur would be able to do for other kinds of animals. Yeah? So insulation is, broadly speaking, characteristic of endotherms, not ectotherms. I won't say that no ectotherms use insulation, but broadly speaking, it's something that is associated with endothermy. Yeah? Yes, they are, yeah. Yeah, they're not terribly useful. Okay, you can also control blood flow to the skin to help maintain body temperature. So that's because blood is traveling throughout your body, and in individuals that have appendages, the core body temperature tends to be warmer than your appendages. And so blood can take heat from the core of your body and help it dissipate through your appendages. Or if you want to maintain your heat, you can reduce blood flow to your appendages, and in particular to your surfaces, to keep the heat more in your core. So if you increase blood flow to the skin by vasodilation, this will increase heat loss and lower body temperature. In contrast, you can constrict blood vessels to reduce blood flow and heat loss. And so in essence, the more blood you have going to your surface, the more heat you're going to dissipate. The more blood flow, the more heat you're going to dissipate. The less blood you have flowing to the surface, the more heat you're going to maintain. But there's this interesting observation that people have made called the Hunter's response. So overall, when a person's hands are exposed to cold temperatures, the surface capillaries constrict to reduce heat loss. That's 100% consistent with what we just saw. But after 5 to 10 minutes, actually, the blood vessels will suddenly dilate. And this is known as the Hunter's response. And it's exaggerated in individuals that live or work in cold environments. So take a minute and talk with your neighbor what you think is a benefit of the Hunter's response and what is a risk. Oh, and if an individual who lives near the equator moves to the Arctic, would you expect them to develop the exaggerated Hunter's response that you see in individuals who live and work in cold environments? Okay, so first, let's see. What do you think is a benefit of the Hunter's response? Yeah? Yep. Yeah, so better use of your hands. So the thing is that as the capillaries are constricted, the temperature of your hands actually drops. The temperature of your fingers drops. Whatever impact that's going to have on so this is going to have an impact on your reaction time and your ability to manipulate your fingers, because Q10 is going to say that everything's going to be slower as the temperature drops, right? And so you want to be able to maintain manual dexterity, which requires an increase in the temperature of your hands. So that's a big benefit there, is you get better manual dexterity. Yeah? So it can also help to prevent frostbite, although frostbite requires that you be so cold that ice crystals are going to form, and that's a slightly different issue than this thermal regulation. Okay, what's a risk of this? Yeah? Yeah, exactly. So what you're doing here, right, is you're increasing blood flow to your extremities to the surface, and you're increasing heat loss to the environment. So then if the whole idea was to keep that heat in your core, now all of a sudden you're like losing it again. So that has the potential to be a problem. But if you're properly attired and it's really just your hands that are cold, then that probably would be okay. Okay, now let's see. If an individual who lives near the equator moves to the Arctic, would you expect them to develop an exaggerated Hunter's response? Hold up your cards in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so I'm seeing a number of different answers, so including all 3 of them. So can somebody who picked yes tell me why you say yes? Can somebody? I saw some yeses out there. Yeah? Sorry, can you say that again? Okay, sorry. I think that I wanted to, I think I didn't ask the question very clearly, so I see what you're saying. What I meant here is that in people who live or work in cold environments, they're the ones where you see this exaggerated response. So the question is, would you expect people who move from a hot environment to a cold environment to see this? So, what? No, so still, does anybody think that you would see them develop an exaggerated response? Yeah? Yeah, so if this is actually a feature of acclimatization, then you would expect them to develop an exaggerated hunter's response, right? Because it's just that you just have to get into the habit. Your body has to get into the habit of responding to the cold in this way to get an exaggerated response. So that's an option. Okay, somebody who said no. Can you say what your reasoning is? Yeah? Right, so you're saying that there's some sort of genetic difference where people who are in this cold environment have this ability to get this exaggerated hunter's response, and people who have no reason to have this exaggerated hunter's response, why would they have that built into their genes? They don't need it. It's not going to help them at all. Okay. What about so they wouldn't. So what about somebody who picked more information needed? Yeah. Yeah, exactly, right? There's nothing in here about what the genetic contribution is for this trait, so it's actually hard to say if it's going to be something that you could acclimatize to or if it's not something that you could acclimatize to. Maybe you have to have it built into your DNA, or maybe you have to have grown up there. Maybe this is something that you need to have developed as a child. Who knows? Given the information, actually, you can't tell which of these the answer is. I will tell you that they've done this, and it actually is yes. So people who move from warm environments to cold environments are capable of developing this exaggerated hunter's response, which suggests that it is something more akin to an acclimatization than to just something that they can or cannot do. Yeah? Yes, and that is a key factor. That's a key differentiation, is that an example of acclimatization, it's the change that happens is not an evolutionary adaptation because it's reversible. And so that's the example with the high altitude oxygen, right? Where you go up, you get lots of red blood cells being made, and then you come back down to sea level and you have all this energy and you feel very fit. But unless you're training in an oxygen depleted environment, then you won't maintain that. And so that's one of the reasons why oxygen reduction chambers are a thing that elite athletes will actually use at lower elevations, usually when they're sleeping, to reduce the oxygen level so that they will keep making more, keep upping their red blood cells. Yeah? I don't know. I just know that they can. Okay, so now let's look at an example of something, speaking of adaptations versus thermoregulatory responses. So countercurrent exchange actually is an adaptation. It is a particular way of organizing blood flow, usually in the limbs, to reduce heat loss. So here what we have are examples of a Canada goose and a bottlenose dolphin. So both of these are endotherms, so they're generating a lot of metabolic heat. They are both, at least parts of their bodies, are in the water for a good portion of the time or for all the time, and water is a great conductor. So they're going to be losing heat to that water all the time. And so they have set up their blood vessels in a way to reduce the amount of heat that's lost through their blood to the environment. And so in a goose, it's probably the most straightforward. So here what we're doing is we're looking at the organization of blood vessels in the leg. So we have blood coming down the leg from the body, where it's very warm, and blood coming back up the leg, returning to the body. And so the blood that's returning to the body is going to be cold because it's lost a lot of its heat to the surroundings. But the setup of the system is such that the animal is actually going to kind of recycle some of that heat, or it's going to pass some of that heat, instead of losing it to the environment, instead of passing the heat coming from the body, losing it to the environment, it's going to pass it to the returning blood. And so what you have is a system set up where arteries and veins are arranged in very close proximity to each other to facilitate this, this heat conservation. So here what we have is an artery where the blood is very warm, and it's going to transfer some of that heat, it's going to lose it to the environment, but it's going to transfer some of that heat to the blood returning to the body, here. So as a consequence, the temperature of the blood is going to drop, and the temperature of the blood keeps dropping as it travels down the leg. Some heat is always being lost to the environment, but other heat is being transferred to the vein. So as the blood returns to the body from the vein, what you have is a situation where the temperature is the lowest down at the bottom here, at the furthest distance from the body. So at this point, the artery has lost the maximum amount of heat, but the vein has also lost the maximum amount of heat, meaning that as soon as you get a little bit closer to the body, you've got heat to transfer from the artery to the vein. As you get a little closer to the body, the temperature of the blood in the vein goes up, but so does the temperature of the blood in the artery. So you can keep transferring energy from the artery to the vein, keep transferring heat, as long as the blood in the artery is still warmer than the blood in the vein. And so it keeps going, incrementally raising the temperature of the blood in the vein as the temperature goes down in the blood in the artery. But you're doing a maximum transfer of heat from the artery to the vein instead of to the environment by having them be in close proximity to each other. So this is a passive process. There's no extra energy required. It just has to do with the setup of the blood vessels in the limbs of these animals. And you observe it, for the most part, in endotherms because they're the ones that have the greatest incentive to conserve that heat. Yeah? So as the heat is always transferred from warmer to colder, so as long as the as long as the temperature in the vein is lower than the temperature in the artery, the bulk of the heat transfer will be from the artery to the vein. And there's not really a way for the blood in the vein to get warmer than the blood in the artery. Now let's think about the dolphin's fin, which is a similar situation. Where would you expect the temperature difference between blood flowing in and out to be the least? Yes, because it's least. Okay, hold up your cards in 3, 2, 1. Yes. So down at the bottom, where both are quite cold, there's going to be minimal heat transfer because the temperature difference just isn't very high. The artery has lost the maximum amount of heat, and the vein has not yet started picking it up. So these are all ways that organisms can try to conserve heat, so through insulation, through this countercurrent exchange. But you also have some situations where you may want to dissipate excess heat. And the main example of this is through evaporative cooling. And we're going to focus on, we're just going to focus on evaporative cooling. So first, why might an animal's body temperature be elevated to the point where it needs to use evaporative cooling? So one example is exercise, yeah. What else? Yeah? Yeah, the temperature of the environment is very warm. Any other ideas? Stress, or in particular, we'll talk in a couple of minutes about a fever. And like if your body temperature has been elevated because of a fever and then you want it to go back down, that's another example. Okay, so the thing is though, and sweating is actually quite effective at dissipating heat because evaporation takes a lot of energy. And so you can dissipate a significant amount of heat. And so this can happen, in humans it happens through sweating. I also mentioned through breathing in the lungs. And then there are animals that will pant, in fact, to lose water out of their oral cavity. It's another example. But there's a couple of challenges that are associated with this. So evaporative cooling comes at a cost. So can anybody tell me what's like the most obvious cost here? Yeah? So one thing is that, yeah, for sure, is that if you're relying on evaporation, sweat dripping off of you is not as effective. What else? Yeah? Yeah, so you're losing a lot of water, especially if you're in a hot environment or if you've been exercising for a while. Anything else? Yeah? Yeah, it also requires energy. And so in order to sweat, you actually have to spend energy in order to produce that sweat. That requires metabolic energy, meaning that you're doing metabolic reactions that you wouldn't otherwise be doing, meaning that you're generating metabolic heat in a way that can actually raise your temperature. And so the body wants to ideally maintain the evaporative cooling at a level where it's actually getting rid of more heat than it's gaining, but that can be a fine balance to strike, depending on what you're doing. Yeah? Uh-huh. So I think that's a great question, and it would depend on what other strategies you're using to cool your body down, because maybe it's the case where she's really good at sweating, but you're really good at vasodilation. So like there could, like, you know, like it just sort of depends on how your body's actually come down on it. Yeah? Yes. Yes, so if you spray yourself with water, then you don't have to worry about producing sweat. Although the sort of caveat there is that they're still probably sweating anyway, because if it's that hot, then they're going to be sweating. But yeah, that particular thing wouldn't require more metabolic energy. Yeah?
What about drinking cool water?
So the question is, drinking cold water can also cool your body temperature because you will transfer heat to the water in your stomach. Yep. Yeah? So the question is about humidity, and what humidity does is it makes it harder for evaporation to occur, period. So you will feel, in many cases, that's not really, I'm going to say it'll feel hotter in more humid environments, but that's actually for different reasons. It's not that you're actually hotter. You can still use evaporative cooling in humid and dry environments. It will still work in both. It's harder to get your sweat to evaporate in a wetter environment, which means that you will be less effective in terms of the evaporative cooling, all other things being equal. All other things being equal, though, is like a kind of a cop-out, because all other things are probably not equal in that situation. So, okay. So, the last thing we're going to talk about is metabolic heat production. So these are not ways of just conserving the heat that you're generating already. These are ways of specifically increasing the heat that you're producing. So the most well-known example of this is probably shivering thermogenesis. So muscle activity, such as moving or shivering, uses a lot of ATP. It is a lot of chemical reactions that are going on there, both in your muscles and also to generate the ATP that you need in those muscles. So like you could be activating things in your liver and having all sorts of different reactions occurring. So when your muscles contract as you shiver, you're going to be doing whatever you need to do to make ATP, and then you're going to be burning that ATP to power those muscle contractions, and these reactions are all going to release some amount of heat. And in particular, in brown fat, the cells can actually manipulate ATP generation to release more energy as heat instead of making ATP. So for shivering thermogenesis, you need to be making ATP. In non-shivering thermogenesis, you're actually not making ATP. You are still using energy, though. So what happens is that normally the oxidation of fuel produces a lot of the generation of ATP through aerobic respiration takes a lot of energy and it produces a lot of ATP. If you bypass ATP production, you can instead shift the balance to make more heat. And so this is a less efficient form of metabolism relative to ATP production, but it's more efficient in terms of heat production. So for those of you who took E1A last semester, we spent a lot of time talking about how you make ATP in cells, and in particular about how much ATP you can get by using mitochondria to perform aerobic respiration. So what happens is that in the mitochondria, you use the energy from breaking down sugar to generate a proton gradient that then is used to power ATP synthesis. And so you store energy in a proton gradient and you capture it by making ATP. You store energy in the proton gradient and you capture it by making ATP. So you make tons and tons of ATP. If instead of making lots of ATP, you want to generate lots of heat, you can send those protons through a protein called UCP1, or uncoupling protein 1, and that literally just dissipates the energy as heat. And so you won't get ATP. Instead, you'll generate lots of heat, and it is actually quite effective in terms of heat generation. And that's called non-shivering thermogenesis. So thermo is heat, genesis is production or making. And the amount of brown fat that an individual has will determine how effectively they can do this process. So for example, babies have lots of brown fat. They're little heat generators. And as individuals get older, they actually have less brown fat relative to everything else that they have in their body. So you become a less effective, less efficient heat generator in that sense. Okay, so the last thing that I wanted, and so here we have as an example, just to see how brown fat is also histologically distinct from white fat. It contains more mitochondria and blood vessels so that it can actually do this thermogenesis. And then I also just want to show that an example where it highlights the idea that the distinction between ectotherm and endotherm is not absolute. So who can tell me what this guy is? It is a moth. Is a moth an ectotherm or an endotherm? It's an ectotherm. So moths, like other insects, are going to be dependent on the environment for the heat that they're going to use. However, sometimes they can actually do things to increase their internal body temperature. So here we have a moth that is in an environment that is very cold, and this moth wants to fly away. The moth is literally too cold to power its wing muscles, right? Just like you can't maneuver your fingers for a variety of reasons when they're very cold, the moth cannot fly when its body temperature is too low. But what it can do is actually a type of shivering thermogenesis to raise its body temperature to a point that will allow it to fly. And so what you see here is that it's moving around more. It's vibrating its wings. This all requires muscle contraction that heats the animal's body temperature until it gets to the point where it is, in fact, going to be warm enough that it can beat its wings for real and fly away in a way that it couldn't have done at the lower temperature. Okay, so we're going to do this next thing relatively quickly, looking at some examples of some different animals. And what I want you to do is watch and identify both evolutionary adaptations that allow for thermal regulation, as well as behavioral or physiological responses that allow for thermal regulation in these animals.
Animals, like people, must keep their body temperature within a certain range to survive. In the harshest environments, some have developed remarkable ways to cope with heat and do just that. Elephants live in hot places and evolved a number of mechanisms for keeping cool. One way is through its skin, which is several sizes too big for its body. Heat energy is lost through the skin, so the more skin, the better. The wrinkles that cover an elephant give it a greater area from which excess heat can escape. While these elephants play, they cool down in the muddy water. Mud collects in their folds and holds moisture near the skin when they leave the pool. This moisture gradually evaporates and cools the elephant over time, much like evaporating sweat cools us. But perhaps the most impressive system for beating the heat can be found in the elephant's ears. As this infrared camera shows in red, these ears radiate a lot of heat. When it's hot, blood vessels in the ears open and allow blood to cool as it flows within the paper-thin skin. Elephants flap their ears as a way of further cooling this blood. All the blood in an elephant, about 100 gallons, can be pumped through its ears in 20 minutes. The cooled blood travels through the rest of its system, cooling both its body and brain. At the coldest place on Earth, the few creatures that are able to survive face the opposite problem. They need to conserve heat energy. In Antarctica, temperatures rarely climb above freezing. But somehow, emperor penguins manage to keep warm. For one thing, they stick together. In brutal winds, they huddle in large groups and take turns standing in the middle. The insulation of others helps them reduce heat loss by almost half. A penguin's feathers are densely packed, overlapping, and waterproof. And it controls these feathers individually. When the temperature drops, it lifts its feathers upright to trap a layer of insulating air next to its body. Penguins have no choice but to stand on the ice on their bare feet. But fortunately, their feet are small and lined with fat. By rocking back on their heels, they keep their contact with the ice to a minimum. As their blood circulates, their body absorbs some of the heat before it reaches their feet. In this case, heat energy travels from the warmer bodies of penguins to the colder environment around them. These penguins need every defense they can get to survive.
Okay, so there's a lot of different thermoregulatory responses going on there, and as well as adaptations that either allow those responses or that do other things to regulate the temperatures. I want to get 3 for the elephants and 3 for the penguins. So who's got ideas for the elephants? I'm going to wait till I have a couple of hands. Okay, what's one? Right, so the amount of blood vessels in their ears, is that an adaptation or a response? That's an adaptation, yeah. Other one, yeah? The wrinkles are their skin, exactly. Is that an adaptation or a response? It's an adaptation. Okay, does anybody have a response? Yeah? So the mud baths, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so now for the penguins, examples of adaptations and responses. Who's got ideas? Yeah? The size of their feet, is that an adaptation or a response? It's an adaptation. Is there a response that also involves their feet? Rocking back on them, yep, to minimize contact. What else? Yeah?
Waterproof feathers.
Waterproof feathers, okay, yep. And what else do the feathers do? Right, so they raise up to provide some insulation. So the waterproofing of the feathers would be an adaptation or a response? That's an adaptation, right? And then what about the fluffing of the feathers? That's going to be a response to generate insulation. It gets a little bit muddled because like the ability to fluff one's feathers is an adaptation. The actual fluffing is a response. But now what we'll talk about, but there are other examples in there that I'm sure you can, that I'm sure you'd be able to find. So what we're going to do now is just take a quick look at some specific ways that thermoregulation happens in humans, and in particular, a situation, the onset and the breaking of a fever that results from a change in the thermoregulatory set point. So I mentioned earlier that the hypothalamus is the control center for temperature, and it integrates thermosensory information, taking in sensory information to say whether you're at the set point and comparing the set point to your current state. And it also regulates physiological thermal responses. So fever raises the body temperature set point. So it's an adaptive response that helps the body fight pathogens because a moderate fever can actually help the body to fight an infection, while an extreme fever can be dangerous. So the increase in body temperature is actually triggered by chemical entities called pyrogens. So there are external sources of pyrogens, including bacteria and viruses, as well as internal sources. So your own immune system can produce interleukins, which will have the same effect. And these interleukins stimulate the production of chemical messengers known as prostaglandins, and these go and they reset the hypothalamic set point to a higher temperature. So you're actually resetting your thermoregulatory set point. So what I want you to do here is think about the temperature of an individual who has a fever, which is shown in the solid line, the set point, which is shown by the dotted line, and what kinds of thermoregulatory responses you'd expect to see at different points. When would you expect to observe each of the following? Shivering, sweating, vasoconstriction, and vasodilation, the onset of the fever, and fever breaking. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm just going to walk through this one. But overall, the onset of the fever corresponds to the point at which the reference temperature or the set point has been altered, and it's the point at which your body temperature starts to rise. The fever breaks when the set point goes back down to normal, and then is set by a corresponding drop in the body temperature. You'd expect to see shivering and vasoconstriction for the most part early on in order to raise your body temperature. And then you might see it again as your body temperature fluctuates around the new set point anytime it drops too low. You would see sweating and vasodilation when the temperature set point drops back down to normal, at which point, at which point your body temperature then would follow. I do want to point out that there is a distinction between fever, which is a regulated hyperthermia, so it's caused by a change in hypothalamic set point, and it rarely exceeds about 41 degrees Celsius, so the complications are pretty uncommon. So moderate fever isn't really something to be worried about, it's just your immune system doing what it's supposed to. In contrast, hyperthermia is caused by a failure in thermoregulation, which can be due either to exercise or the environment or some combination of the two. In this case, your core body temperature can exceed 41 degrees Celsius, which is quite dangerous, and complications can be severe. So what do you think about ectotherms? Can they experience a fever? Hold up your cards in 3, 2, 1. So they actually can. So when desert iguanas, for example, are infected with bacteria, they have been known to regulate their body temperature behaviorally. So they'll spend more time in the sun, less time in the shade to raise their body temperature, which can also help them fight infections the same way it helps us. Okay, so a couple of final points that I wanted to make. One is that endotherms in particular have evolved morphological adaptations to reduce heat loss. A lot of these come from changing the surface area to volume ratio. So there are two rules that generally characterize this. There's Bergmann's rule and Allen's rule. So Bergmann's rule refers to the overall body size, meaning that, and it states that overall, animals that live in colder climates will have bigger bodies because it reduces the surface area to volume ratio. Allen's rule refers to appendages. So B, Bergmann for body, A, Allen for appendages. So Allen's rule is that protruding body parts of mammals and birds are shorter in cold climates when you compare them to individuals of the same species living in warmer climates. So do you think that these rules apply in humans? In 3, 2, 1, what do you think? So we see some combination, and it turns out that there are some examples where they do seem to hold up, but there are also exceptions. So it's not super clear. So in populations that have lived that live in the Canadian Arctic and that have lived there for a long period of time, the individuals do tend to have stockier bodies and shorter limbs, whereas individuals that live in warmer climates, like in Kenya, tend to have a linear build and longer limbs, but this isn't universally true. And so finally, I do want to mention that some animals, just like we have a regulated hyperthermia in the case of fever, there's also regulated hypothermia, which is daily torpor and hibernation. So torpor, which when we talk about torpor, we're talking about these, it's called daily torpor, which are daily cycles of reduced activity. And it corresponds to a reduction in an individual's temperature set point. It tends to occur at night, or at least whenever it happens to be colder, and it permits the individual to use a lower metabolic rate. The idea here is that it's for animals that need to reduce their metabolic rate so that they don't starve when it gets cold. So it's observed in animals mostly that are small, like bats and hummingbirds. And so the idea is that during the day, they're going to be eating pretty much continually in order to obtain the energy they need for metabolism. At night, they literally can't keep eating because it is nighttime. And so they will reduce their metabolism, reduce their temperature to conserve energy so they don't starve overnight. Hibernation is a related phenomenon, but it occurs seasonally. So it's not daily, it's seasonal. And the new set point in some cases may be close to the ambient temperature, even relatively close to freezing, which for something like a mammal, which would normally have a set point in the 30s, that's quite a big change. The individual's metabolic rate is going to drop, and it'll last for days or weeks. And when it comes to hibernation, the first thing that has to happen is that there needs to be an arousal period where the individual increases their metabolic heat production to get their set point back to normal so that their body can warm up. And so here just we have an example of a hummingbird, and this is a graph that literally shows their metabolic rate in the at night. So when they're not eating, when they have reduced their metabolic rate, it's much, much lower than it is during the day when they are active. And then this is a really cute, it's a species of lemur, the fat-tailed dwarf lemur. And this one actually hibernates for up to 7 months a year. having to do more with water availability and so the availability of food than it necessarily being cold, although there are many other species that you're probably familiar with that hibernate specifically during the colder months as opposed to the drier months. And with that, I will leave you to contemplate the intricacies of homeostasis and thermal regulation, and I will see you, maybe not next time, but I will see you soon.